The checkered wool coat was still damp with morning dew when David shook it out and hung it on the rail in the hallway of the old stone mansard-roofed house at the end of the lane. It hung on a garden post when evening came and lasted until dawn, becoming visible through the haze of hot coffee, while the owner of the house looked at the fresh soil of the garden plot. A shovel was at the ready to dig up vegetables as needed. At exactly 9 a.m., as the clock on the mantelpiece struck the hour, the doorbell rang and his spoon fell to the floor. The opening was hasty, careful turning of the handle, but still hurried. "Good morning, sir. Are you David Morris?" The taller of the two, rather dull-looking gentlemen stood on the porch, looking more past him than at him. "Yes, sir, it's me. How can I help? I'm Lieutenant Detective Simpson, and this is my partner, Detective Sigerson." He nodded almost imperceptibly at the short man behind him. "Can we come in? We are investigating a case involving Lydia Morris. She's your wife, isn't she?" Surprise showed on his face, and with lively determination David invited the gentlemen into the drawing room, inviting them to freshen up as soon as they were seated. Both men were deadly serious as they declined the offer and continued their interrogation. "Mr. Morris, when was the last time you saw your wife?" the lieutenant detective asked as his wandering eyes took in the furnishings and decor of the room. "I think it was last weekend, Saturday morning to be exact. She went to visit her family and it's good. Her mother lives on an old farm and does not seem to be in good health." "What's the matter, detective?" Both detectives looked at each other before the chief continued, ignoring his question. "Understand. We know you run a firm on Congress Street, securities, investments, right?" David simply nodded, but noted the readiness of his interrogators. "So, have you talked to her since she left?" "No, she prefers things to remain this way when she leaves for the village. She knows how I feel about most of her family, and she also understands how they feel about me. Again, what are we talking about, detective? Do you know Philip Bergman?" The detective asked briefly. The elder seemed a little irritated by this interruption, but said nothing. "I heard the name, but I don't think I was ever officially acquainted with him. Perhaps you should talk to the woman next door. I think she was Bergman. Her name is Rosalind Sanders, that's her last name, but I'm sure she was Bergman." Perhaps out of nervous habit or unconscious distraction, David involuntarily glanced at the back of the house, where the door to the garden was open to fresh air. "Considering the circumstances, Mr. Morris, we suspect there may be more to it than innocent coincidences. We have contacted your wife's family, and they have not heard from her since her previous visit last month. You understand our concern, I'm sure." David looked at the two men for a few seconds. "Do you suspect that Philip Bergman has something to do with Lydia's disappearance?" LT. Detective Simpson looked directly at David, informing him that they did not have enough information at this time to make that conclusion. "Did Mrs. Morris Philip Bergman, as far as you know?" Maybe it was a flash of fear about unwanted circumstances showing on his forehead or deep in his eyes. He was sure the detectives had noticed, but he said nothing and simply shook his head. "We will need to explore the house and surroundings, Mr. Morris. Standard procedure, you know." "What? Surely I'm not a suspect in this case?" The detectives looked at him and put aside the formalities. "We can get a warrant if necessary, sir." "In that case, I'll need my lawyer." David excused himself and went into the office to make a few calls before returning to the living room and telling the detectives that his lawyer was on the way and they would need a warrant to proceed. The two men simply looked at each other, and the older man walked out onto the porch to request a warrant. Half an hour later, two more police officers arrived along with David's lawyer, and the search and investigation continued. 2 weeks ago, Lydia Morris, Rosalind Sanders Phillip, her ex-husband, had sex. Rosaline turned to Lydia. "Do you still think we can pull this off?" she asked her neighbor. "If I didn't think, we wouldn't be here. Besides, David is like clay to me. Once we have the money, Philip will take care of the rest," Lydia said to Rosalind as Philip rubbed his hands in joy. "6 million, as you said, right? Tripartite division?" Philip asked, to which Lydia nodded with approval. She wasn't always so calculating and dissolute. There had been good years, as she remembered, but it had turned into something unsatisfactory. Somewhere there was greener grass, bigger rings, new models, and shiny trinkets. David was level-headed, predictable and boring, but Philip with his eternal fun mode. He told her that he would kill for her. Perhaps this impregnated path began many years ago in its good, where her mother parked an old, beat-up trailer behind a barn on her family's abandoned farm. Lydia and her sister shared folding beds while their mother entertained an assortment of men at the other end of the trailer, often sending the sisters to play in the barn while she did her own thing. She measured herself against the pathetic fate her mother had chosen and chose to escape, vowing to become something, anyone, but not who she had been while living in that tin can. But in the end, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Rosaline watched in silence until she whispered, "I want to see him kill him." For some strange reason, all three of them thought this was the funniest thing and laughed in unison. The lieutenant detective stood looking at the fresh soil of the garden, rubbing his forehead in deep thought. He had already tested the loose soil with an iron rod and found nothing. Still, something about it haunted him. The soil was sandier and much lighter than the dark soil around her. She didn't come. "You work a lot in your garden, Mr. Bosch, Morris?" he asked. "Yes, I've been arranging the beds. I'm thinking of planting good rows of greenery for next fall." It still remained unresolved. Detectives and the rest of the search party searched the house and basement, as well as the grounds, and later gathered in front of the house in an animated conversation. David stood watching them with his lawyer. "This is standard procedure, David. There's no need to worry at this stage, but we definitely need to sit down and discuss the day's events and take precautions." The police remained in the front yard for a considerable time until several neighbors gathered at their mailboxes, pondering all the fuss. Rosalind Sanders's house remained inconspicuously quiet, seemingly empty and indifferent, not the slightest movement behind the curtains. David's attention was drawn to the vibration of his phone in his pocket. "Ready." The message read on the screen. Nothing more needed to be said. Two detectives went to Rosaline's house, rang the bell, and knocked several times on the massive oak door facing the street, but to no avail. They looked into the bushes and even into one of the windows before coming up to the back of the house. Sigerson bent down and picked up something from the back door to the sun porch. "I found something you need to see," he shouted to his elder. Wearing gloves, the senior detective held the evidence up to the light and examined it carefully before whistling to the rest of the officers still on the property. Marcus, and they hurried to the back of the Sanders house. Of course, they conferred for several minutes until one of them turned the doorknob and entered an unlocked abode. David's lawyer settled into a comfortable chair in his office and reviewed tapes while his client watched from next door. Soon another car arrived and two officers entered the house. After another 15 minutes, a flurry of activity began, agitating the entire area. Another police car arrived, followed by an ambulance, and they all entered the house. For several minutes, officers ran back and forth between the front door and the backyard. Obviously, they found something. The lawyer noted, watching as the doctors entered the house with a stretcher. Almost an hour later, they came out with several black plastic bags, fixed on a stretcher, and both investigators followed them. When the stretcher loaded into the car, LT, Detective Simpson and Detective Sigerson returned to the House Morozov. "Mr. Arhus, attorney, we would like your client to come to the station to give a formal statement," Simpson said, looking at the lawyer. "It is not necessary. My client won't say anything new. Whatever you want to ask can be done here, but I repeat, he has nothing to state at this stage. If you would like to read my client his rights, please do so now. You know we can take him and hold him." The younger detective interjected, while the older one frowned at him. "And I will file a motion for immediate release. Meanwhile, if you've completed the search, let's get this over with, okay? We understand that the warrant will give you the right to return if necessary, but I insist on my presence in this case, as is the right of my client." Both detectives weren't happy about being sent away so easily, but they knew they had no choice if Morhes did not want to cooperate. An immediate release order would ensure his freedom before sunset, especially with the lawyer's well-known connections. Still, Simpson reflected on his doubts. The fresh soil continued to spark interest, and there was more. The house was modestly furnished on the outside, but every detail and choice of accents spoke of subtle taste and wealth. The marble tray next to the sofa was not a cheap knockoff. Wealth was sophisticated, almost deliberately hidden in simplicity. After years of police work, this man knew one thing: money is always a potential motivating factor in suspicious circumstances. And now the circumstances, at least in the house next door, were more than suspicious. It wasn't just about what happened there, but also about the mystery of who made the call and what brought them here in the first place. It was last Wednesday, and they were upstairs in the master bedroom of Rosaline's house, finalizing their final plans. "Are you going to gut him?" Rosalind asked her ex. Lydia looked at her. They never planned to kill David, only planning to transfer the money and go to South America, possibly Uruguay. This was fine until it turned out that only Lydia had a passport, and Philip had outstanding warrants, and Rosaline was only interested in illegal drugs and sex, and she didn't care where. Lydia decided that they would separate when everything was over. They were both stupid people anyway. The best-laid plans are never matched by stupidity and besotted minds. Rosaline and Philip offered to kill him and dispose of the body, making it appear that David had run off with the money. Lydia shrugged and agreed with this proposal. Either way, they were here now and 2 days away from executing their dark plan. Lydia reflected on the past few days. Obtaining passwords was especially easy. It was much easier than she thought. They were in Black David's little book right in the front drawer. Once everything was done, she would need to remove her traces, but she couldn't do that until the transactions were completed a few minutes after the transfers. This was her part of the deal. Philip and Rosaline will take care of David, and they will meet here in the house. By the next morning, police had left the scene in the neighborhood, except for one police cruiser parked at the curb and an off-duty officer sitting in the front seat. While pouring himself a cup of tea in the kitchen, David took a biscuit from the bread bin and placed a piece of ham on it, tossing a random piece to the black cat at his feet. A small smile crossed his face as he remembered yesterday. The older detective was quite sophisticated, too sophisticated for his own good, while the younger one was just a mechanic doing his job, expecting a reward in the form of donuts. The audacity to suspect him of complicity, the audacity to act in the face of nothing. Thank God the lawyer acted quickly and they left empty-handed, otherwise he would still be entertaining their fantasies even at this late hour, he thought to himself as he prepared for bed. Morning came quickly and David headed to his offices to assist with the routine checking of bank transactions and account activity. Although he managed a very profitable portfolio, the staff was small and efficient. 3 employees to manage the accounts and an office manager to handle the back office. "Mr. Morris, we seem to have a problem." A stern and strict lady addressed him in a rather loud voice during a lunch break. There was an attempt to carry out a series of very large transfers, and all but one were stopped by the control system. "What are you talking about, Miss Allen?" he said as the rest of the staff looked up. "What I mean is that several client accounts were set up for bank transfers last Friday afternoon, and they were blocked by the monitoring system installed here in the office, all except your personal account. $16 million was transferred, all for one check in the Cayman Islands, opened by your wife, and as it turned out, this account was subsequently emptied. A couple of hours later, David's lawyer, one of the bank's directors, an auditor, an FBI special agent, and 2 already familiar detectives gathered in the office conference room to discuss new revelations. Lydia Morris apparently gained access to investment accounts and attempted to steal nearly $18 million, and after failing to do so, transferred only her husband's $16 million balance. "Morris, you could do it yourself," Detective Sigerson said before his superior could intervene. The detective lieutenant simply rolled his eyes and shook his head. "Why the hell would I do that? I'm sitting right here, and it's my money that's gone, not anyone else's," David responded indignantly as his lawyer held his hand, trying to keep the peace. Mr. Morhuswe, did it take so long to discover the alleged theft? Simpson asked. I know that I did not make any transactions on Friday afternoon, and Monday was a holiday, and I was not in the office until today. On Tuesday, I had meetings with clients, and yesterday, as you know, I was at home. We conduct account audits every Thursday. We don't have a very big operation. Simpson considered the man's response and eventually came to some kind of agreement. There was little point in him orchestrating the theft of his own money, and as managing director of his firm, he would have the right to bypass control systems. At this point, all evidence seems to point to the wife's involvement. The ringing of the phone interrupted his thoughts, and a few minutes later, he returned to his partner and David. Looks like Mrs. Morhus was found in long-term parking at Manchester Airport this morning, and we were just notified by state police. I'd say she's the most likely suspect at this point. What about the body found in the house next door to Mr. Marcus? David's lawyer asked. The identity has been established as Philip Bergman, as well as a second man, whose identity is still unknown. Simpson responded with a straight face. The task is not pleasant. As for Rosalind Sanders, we don't know where she is yet. I won't make too many assumptions, but Miss Sanders and Mrs. Morhus may be involved together, or the two crimes may be completely separate incidents. We just don't know until all the evidence is processed at the government lab. Mr. Morhus, I ask that you remain available for further questioning if necessary, and we will likely want to re-examine both areas. The feds will be looking into wire fraud issues from now on. David and his lawyer agreed, of course, and the detectives gathered their materials while two FBI agents set up a processing center in the conference room. They have already traced the original postings and identified 6 transfers from accounts in the Cayman Islands, each of which was transferred to a different offshore account and is currently untraceable. By the end of the day, Lydia Morhus was a wanted suspect on 8 federal charges of wire fraud and theft. Rosalind Sanders remained a person of interest in both murders at her home and as a possible accomplice to Lydia in her crimes. Lydia made the evening news when David poured himself a bourbon and tossed a piece to the cat. Seeing her photo on the screen was unsettling and satisfying, troubling in the sense that there were many open questions, and it was satisfying to know that he was not a suspect in these sinister affairs. Lydia could do it, maybe not 10 years ago when they first met, but now, yes, she could do it all. It seemed like yesterday, to quote a cliché, but it was a reasonable truth. Lydia was a regular at the Montrose Bar, a shirt and tie establishment on Congress Street in the business district. She was a couple of steps above a woman of easy virtue and a few steps below a lady, but she was well brought up and controlled herself. Lydia Morhus was a beautiful and attractive woman in a rugged manner, perhaps 5'6" in stockings, with small breasts and full hips, always ready for frowning or smiling lips. She tried to be blonde for a while, but it distracted from her natural, vibrant beauty. With smoky, dark brown, almond-shaped eyes and a languid expression on his face, David was easily seduced. They quickly turned their romance into a profitable marriage, and as the business flourished, the comforts of comfort permeated most aspects of their relationship. A few years later, the smoky attraction faded, and they moved through life the same way as many other couples. A day here, a week there, and then the same thing again. While David was content with most of his life, Lydia craved something else, perhaps the attention she received when she sat like a prize during the Montrose days. In time, she found it in a downtown hotel bed with several lovers, each with their own satisfying talents and limitations. In the end, the illegal substances found her, and debauchery gained unlimited access. Rosalind Sanders moved next door, and Lydia soon became a regular visitor, while her husband ran the business. Rosalind fueled Lydia's sense of adventure, hanging out with her at various bars and dating spots along the city's waterfront. Then Philip started to come. They were married once, but she divorced him when he was jailed several years ago, but they continued their relationship after his release. He came back for a year, and after that he began to come when Lydia was nearby. Within a week, he had both women. With all her intentions and expectations of restraint, Lydia couldn't hide it when it completely consumed her. It was debauchery that David saw, and he took action in his own way. Lighting a cigarette, Lydia looked at Rosaline. I need to finish the job after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. This is the time when David finishes his accounts and has a meeting with his staff before going home. He will be back home around 7 in the evening. Act quickly and without further ado, Rosaline. Philip, can you hear me? No madness. Just do everything right, like we agreed. Now let's get ourselves in order. I need to go home. Lydia looked back at the two, wondering when the Mexican would show up. He was part of Philip's plan, not hers, and as long as everything went according to plan, she didn't care. She had already decided that this was the last time she would see any of them. She took her bag, went into the house, and quickly took a shower. The plane ticket was lying on the table when Lydia took out the passwords for the accounts. Obtaining passwords was especially easy. It was much easier than she thought. They were in Black Book David's right in the front drawer. Once everything was done, she would need to remove her traces, but she couldn't do that until the transactions were completed a few minutes after the transfers. This was her part of the deal. Philip and Rosaline will take care of David, and they will meet here in the house. Just. A few minutes later, the transfers began, and before she could congratulate herself, a system prompt appeared on the screen asking for the administrative password required for the transfer. She tried the same password, but couldn't until she got to the last transaction, a transfer of David's funds from his personal account. The transaction went through and $16 million was transferred to an account in the Cayman Islands. Lydia sat scolding the computer and her husband, and hit the table until she leaned back and lit a cigarette. Damn, it's better than nothing. She loaded a couple of bags into the car, and then, taking her family box in the basement, went down the stairs. Mr. Morhus, why is the soil in this row much sandier and lighter than the rest of the soil in the garden? Simpson asked, running his fingers through the loose soil. I collected several cubic meters when they were dismantling one site at the other end of the city. One guy said I could take it, so I loaded up a few truckloads. It's better for drainage than what's already here. David answered quickly. Interesting. When they returned to the house, David suggested that the officer freshen up, and this time he agreed. I see you are a book lover, Mr. Morhus. Yeats, Hawthorne, Welty, Poe, Chekhov, Eliot, Melville. An impressive collection. Yes, I have been an avid reader since childhood. I prefer a good book to TV any day. I'm a Stephen King fan myself. Oh, he's good in his genre, but I wouldn't put him up against Poe, even on his best days. David said proudly, running his fingers along the spine of the first edition of the author's collection of short stories. I've never read it. As I said, I love King, and that author who writes about the CIA, what's his name? Clancy. I love this Clancy. The detective replied before getting down to business. The FBI seized David's laptop as evidence and did not find Lydia's laptop, assuming she disappeared with it. They didn't find anything incriminating on David's laptop, so they were ready to return it within a few days. The state police said you can take your wife's car whenever you're ready. There was nothing remarkable about her. There is no record in the terminal of her boarding a flight under her name, nor of Rosalind Sanders or her maiden name Bergman. Some believe the car was just a distraction, and they may be right. Anyway, let's see what comes up. Usually, the criminal makes a mistake and the transaction can be traced. We'll see over time. What about the second body? Do you know who it was? Asked David. Not at the moment. We took as many prints as possible, but nothing was found in our system. Perhaps it was an illegal immigrant, since he was Spanish. The detective finished his business and returned to the house next door for a while before leaving. David watched him from the living room, sipping his tea. House Morozov was only a short walk from Congress Street, making it a convenient residential location close to the commercial area. In the 1920s, this house belonged to a certain well-known person from Boston with connections to Ireland and the rough working people of industrial Birmingham. In 1919, he began the reconstruction of the house in the style post-bellum after returning from the Great War without much damage, and then the coming of 1920 changed a lot of things. In 1921, Liam McCavey was smuggling Irish whiskey into a small creek not far from Lubecca, and his men brought it to Portland to sell in a half-dozen speakeasies. The rest of the cargo was sent to Boston to finance the era on Green Island. It didn't last long before local police, with the help of federal agents, began ransacking warehouses throughout the city, damaging both supplies and the moral freedom of the people. McCavey. In the middle of remodeling my home, McCavey took action to restore his business and secrecy. With careful nightly excavation, an underground stone corridor was built, leading to a large room with an adjoining tunnel to the neighboring house, which belonged to another unscrupulous person with similar inclinations. With patient skill, both ends were equipped with secret passages hidden behind what appeared to be solid granite walls in the basements of each house. The room was isolated to suppress sounds of activity from prying ears. It served its purpose well during the Prohibition years, and many cases of whiskey and other contraband passed through her corridors until the repeal of the law came and her use ceased. During the war in the 1940s, owners considered her as a refuge in case Portland was captured by the Germans, which was a stupid idea, but it was available if necessary. After that, it was just a novelty and became forgotten as generations passed. It was an old ledger and a bundle of documents found in a distant attic that again shed light on this innovation, and David Morris played with his secret room like a child in a candy store until it found a new purpose, sinister in design and suitable for the circumstances. The far end of the tunnel was blocked and filled with sandy soil for privacy, but it once opened into the granite basement of the Sanders house next door. Lydia's eyes adjusted to the dim light in the cell, trying to figure out where she was again. The walls of granite blocks and slate tiles embedded in the sandy soil beneath her feet offered no clues other than that the granite was similar to that in her own basement and in 1,000 other houses in the city. In the corner of the chamber stood an old tiled tank collecting water from a hidden spring. Comfortable. A familiar voice asked quietly from the dark corridor. Deprived of all her feelings, Lydia could not determine whose voice was speaking to her. It seemed familiar, but distant. Drops of water falling into the tank distracted her, like the dull blow of a hammer on a flat surface, deafening and at the same time. Who? Who are you? Where am I? She answered, realizing the futility of this. There was no answer. The shadowy figure simply stood there, watching her from his hiding place. A moment later, he was gone, leaving her alone with the light and the symphony playing on the walls of the tank. The sharp sound of the closing door filled the cell with loneliness. Fear haunted her senses and irrationality consumed her every thought. She had no idea how long she had been kept in this state. It seemed like hours, but in reality several days had passed. The small pouch contained several tins of fish and biscuits, enough to sustain her for the short duration of her captivity, but barely. Lydia could look into the dark tunnel leading to Sanders' house, but could not go there. All she could do at the moment was scream, and she screamed until she was hoarse from the useless effort. "This makes no sense. It only bothers the rats," said a voice from the tunnel. The voice was clearer now, and she recognized it, recoiling in fear at the revelation. "David," was all she could say, her eyes widening in horror. He entered the cell, and his wife, trembling in the corner, looked in horror at his appearance. She tried to scream, but nothing came out. "Well, hello to you too." He grinned. "For better or worse, Lydia," he said. "What? For what?" she answered, not understanding anything. "For better or worse. That's what we promised each other. I keep my promise, darling, even if it's the worst. I don't know. Of course you don't know, honey, but you should know. It was in your vows and in mine, and here we are, living in this happiness. I keep my vows, Lydia, just as I promised. I will take care of you until the end, either yours or mine." The poor woman was spinning various stories in her head. "They made me do it. I never intended to do it. I just went along with it until we could eliminate them, honey. I never intended to kill you." In the end, she just stared at her husband in pathetic defeat. "I still have work, dear. I'll be back in the evening," said David. Lydia was still sitting at the wooden table when David returned in the evening, freshly bathed following his efforts to settle matters with his opponents. He walked up to one of the walls and, raising his hand, removed the lid from what appeared to be a pipe or conduit running into the ceiling, about a foot in diameter. When he finished, he threw the canvas bag to his wife, who continued to sit silently, afraid to utter a word, seeing those heads in his hands. It contained a change of clothes and more canned food, as well as her personal toiletries. Every time you see this bag, remove its contents and hang it up. Her back on the hook. If you don't, this will be the last bag you get. David looked at her without showing the slightest glimmer of love in his eyes. She had been planning the theft and his murder for months, but there was a promise. For better or worse, he would do his part whether she liked it or not. Using steel rods and concrete, David sealed the passage to the Sanders house from the tunnel and closed the heavy wooden door leading from the chamber into the tunnel, locking it tightly. He looked at her, sitting and not believing that he would leave her in such conditions. She had clean clothes, her personal items, notepads and pens, even her glasses to put to good use. Over time, he will give her more things: light bulbs, hair scissors, even a bottle of alcohol to ease her suffering. What he gave her, in his understanding, was a sentence to life instead of death. 2 weeks after the grisly discoveries in the House Sanderson, the woman's body was caught from Casco Bay by a lobster, pulling traps on the shore. She had been in the water for a couple of days by the looks of it, and after an autopsy, it was determined that Rosalind Sanders died from too many illegal substances in her system. How she ended up in the water remained a mystery, as did where she had been in the previous days. Each of the cases remained open, and at some point, Lt. Detective Simpson visited the house again Morosofto see if he had heard anything from his wife. We suspect that the case is related to prohibited substances, bad deals, or old feud. Bergman was identified as a local supplier at the port, and Sanders allegedly met her end as a result of this connection. As for the Spaniard, who knows? Simpson explained. Mrs. Family Morris, did you apply? Maybe they heard something, although I suspect that, being related, they won't want to share. David simply shook his head, and after some more talking, he walked his guest to the door and said goodbye. He never spoke to Simpson again. The months turned into years, and Lydia Morris remained a captive, cared for by her husband, who kept his promise. It was for the worst. She had been trapped there behind granite walls for over 6 years by then, and it had taken a toll on the remnants of her mind that would have exhausted even the most hardened caretaker. She muttered to herself as she walked back and forward around the room, gloomily thinking about his betrayal and the reason for his imprisonment. Both souls were lost, for her dark walls and her betrayal, and him in perverted revenge, but the routine continued until the last moment of the promise. He was tired, unusually so, and as he walked towards the work shed with a bag in his hands, he had to stop to catch his breath. The sun was high and warm, but he was cold and felt dry. The bench and chest had long been standing aside, so he only needed to remove the hatch cover and lower the bag. He did so and looked down, seeing Lydia looking at him from the darkness below. Their eyes met, and a sharp pain shot through his chest. He clenched in agony before his body collapsed, his face buried in the hole and his eyes remaining open but lifeless. Lydia screamed in horror. This scenario played out in her wounded mind many times. What if he leaves and doesn't come back, or is killed, or just dies? Now this was her reality, and she screamed into the hole, hoping to wake up her husband, her jailer. With the work shed door open and David dead on the floor, there was no more for better or worse. All that's left is the finality. While David's life was quickly slipping away from him, 2,000 miles away, retired Captain Simpson sat in the window of a Boeing 737 heading back to Portland. He opened an anthology of stories by Edgar Allan Poe and, immersed in the cask of Amontillado, pondered what had always tormented him in the case Morozov. That sandy soil in the garden Morozov a few years ago. An interesting collection of stories, isn't it? The flight attendant interrupted his thoughts. What a cunning and insidious way to carry out revenge, even if the crime may have been imaginary, by walling up one's opponent in a wall. What? Simpson asked. The story you are reading. It's about immuring the cask of Amontillado. Sorry, I studied English in college, majoring in literature. I was always amazed at how dark and almost flawless the plans were for Montresor. The attractive flight attendant smiled and continued on her way, and Simpson remembered his worries. He just couldn't figure out what it was until now. He had seen the same soil around the basement walls in both the Moorhes and Sanders houses, and now he understood what it could mean. After 6 years of torment, the evidence of what he had missed emerged with startling realization. He knew his next steps. Several hours of arduous excavator work, carefully exhuming a murderous prostitute from her granite sarcophagus to place her in the pleasant but sterile conditions of a state hospital for the mentally disabled. As the surviving spouse, she had a right to David's estate, but with Candy's mental capacity that no longer mattered. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even click to the next one.